I want you to picture a scene. It's the late 1960s. You are standing inside this really high-tech facility, buzzing with the sound of teletype machines and the hum of these massive radio receivers.
Oh,
Outside, there are giant satellite dishes just pointed at the sky. And inside, you have American intelligence officers, and they are listening to everything.
like Soviet naval chatter in the Indian Ocean or diplomatic cables from the Middle East.
Exactly. Maybe even the launch codes for a localized conflict. It feels like a Tom Clancy novel set in a secret bunker in West Berlin or maybe deep in the Virginia woods.
It definitely has that classic Cold War aesthetic to it. But you aren't in Europe, and you aren't in the United States.
No. You are 7,000 feet above sea level in the mountains of East Africa, specifically Asmara, which was part of Ethiopia at the time. This was Cagnew Station. And for a really solid chunk of the Cold War, this wasn't just some remote outpost. It was arguably the United States' most important ear on the entire Eastern Hemisphere.
It is a great place to start our deep dive today, because Cagnes Station is really the physical proof of just how deep that relationship was. We aren't talking about a casual diplomatic friendship here. This was a strategic marriage.
A full-blown marriage, yeah.
Huh.
And that is the hook for today's deep dive. Because if you fast forward barely a decade from that scene, from the Americans drinking coffee and monitoring Soviet frequencies.
Those Americans are packing their bags in a complete panic.
Right. The dishes are going dark. And suddenly that same country, Ethiopia, is hosting thousands of Cuban troops and clearing the runway for massive Soviet cargo planes just filled with tanks.
It is the ultimate geopolitical mood swing. We are looking at a country that went from being Washington's absolute anchor in the Horn of Africa to becoming Moscow's fortress on the continent. And it happened incredibly fast.
So today we are unpacking Ethiopia's Cold War pivot. We are going to figure out how a monarchy that literally traced its lineage back to the Bible ended up as a Marxist military junta, and what happened when the Cold War chessboard completely flipped over in the Horn of Africa.
And looking at the sources, this story really challenges the way we usually think about the Cold War. It wasn't just superpowers moving passive pieces on a board. It was local leaders actively using superpowers to survive.
Yeah.
It is a story about internal revolution betrayal and a war where Soviet weapons were literally used to destroy other Soviet weapons.
I love that detail, and we are definitely going to get into the pure absurdity of that hardware situation later, but let's establish the baseline first. Before everything went sideways in the 70s, what was the status quo?
To really understand the pivot, you have to understand the Emperor, Haile Selassie. He ruled Ethiopia for decades, and he was this larger-than-life figure. In the West, he was seen as a dignified, modernizing monarch, as the Lion of Judah.
Right.
And geopolitically, he made a very calculated decision to align his empire with the United States.
And the U.S. was incredibly happy to oblige. I read in the source material that between the 50s and the 70s, Ethiopia received more U.S. military aid than the rest of Africa combined.
That is a staggering statistic, isn't it? It just shows the strategic value. The U.S. needed Cagnew Station because, due to simple physics and Ethiopia's high altitude near the equator, it was one of the few places on Earth where you could relay radio signals clearly halfway around the world.
Wow.
In exchange for that listening post, Selassie got American jets, American training, and American money to equip his army.
So if you look at the map in the Situation Room in the White House at that time, Ethiopia is a solid blue tile. It's the pillar of stability in a pretty rough neighborhood.
Exactly.
But as we know from going through these historical sources, stability in the Cold War often just meant ignoring what's happening in the streets.
That is the classic facade of stability.
Yeah.
While the diplomats in Washington were happy, the internal situation in Ethiopia was rotting. You had a feudal agricultural system that was increasingly out of touch with the modern world.
Yeah.
You had a devastating famine in the Wollo province in the early 70s that killed tens of thousands of people. And the aristocracy essentially tried to cover it up.
And you had the students. I was really surprised to see how much of the revolutionary energy early on came from university students who were actively reading Marxist literature.
Absolutely. The student movement was crucial here. They were in the streets, chanting land to the tiller, demanding massive land reform.
Yeah.
But the real tipping point, the thing that actually breaks the system, is the military.
The rank and file.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The soldiers were just tired. They were fighting brutal insurgencies in Eritrea. The pay was terrible and morale was at rock bottom. And historically, when the military stops believing in the emperor...
The emperor is finished.
Precisely.
So that brings us to 1974. This is the year the dam breaks. But the sources describe the revolution in a really interesting way. It wasn't a sudden explosion like storming the Bastille. They actually call it the creeping coup.
That's the perfect term for it. It was slow-motion strangulation. A committee of low-ranking military officers, so majors, captains, non-commissioned officers, they formed a group called the Derg. And in Amharic, Derg literally just means committee.
Which sounds incredibly bureaucratic for a group that is about to overthrow an ancient dynasty.
It started that way. But this committee methodically stripped the emperor of his powers over several months. They arrested his ministers, they nationalized his palaces, and eventually in September 1974, they deposed Haile Selassie himself.
And they drove him away, right?
Yeah, he was driven away in the back of a green Volkswagen Beetle.
That image is just wild to me. The King of Kings, the Lion of Judah, taken away in a VW Bug. That is the definitive end of an era.
And the beginning of a massive geopolitical nightmare for the United States.
Yeah.
Because the power vacuum was filled by the Derg and eventually dominated by a man named Mengistu Haile Mariam. And Mengistu was not interested in maintaining the American alliance. He was a hardliner.
This is where the operating system of the country gets entirely reinstalled. The Derg officially declares Ethiopia a Marxist-Leninist state. They start using language that sounds like it was faxed directly from the Kremlin.
Completely.
They nationalize industries, they seize land, and crucially for our story, they kick the Americans out.
Kagnu Station is closed. The U.S. Military Advisory Group is expelled. It is a total rupture of relations.
So put yourself in Moscow's shoes for a second. You have been trying to get a solid foothold in Africa for years. You've had some minor successes, but nothing major. And suddenly, the biggest, most populous, most strategically located country in the region just drops into your lap.
It was a massive opportunity for them. Now, the Soviets had already been supporting Somalia, which is Ethiopia's neighbor because Somalia was a socialist state at the time. But let's be honest, in terms of grand strategy, Ethiopia is the real prize.
Right, because of the geography.
Exactly. It controls the headwaters of the Blue Nile. It dominates the Red Sea coast. It has the population mass.
But this is where the story gets really messy. And this is the part that I think is the most purely Cold War thing to ever happen. You have Somalia. They are a Soviet ally. They have Soviet tanks. Then you have Ethiopia. They just become a Soviet ally. They want Soviet tanks. But these two countries completely despise each other.
This is the Ogaden dilemma. The Ogaden is a huge desert region of eastern Ethiopia that is ethnically Somali. The government in Somalia had always claimed it as part of Greater Somalia.
So the leadership in Somalia looks across the border at Ethiopia. They see the chaos of the revolution. They see the Ethiopian military literally purging its own experienced officers. And they think now is the time to strike.
Precisely. In 1977, Somalia invades. And the optics of this are incredibly confusing for the world. You have a Somali army trained by the Soviets, equipped with Soviet T-55 tanks and MiG fighters, invading a Marxist Ethiopian state that is desperately begging Moscow for help.
It is essentially a communist civil war, and Moscow is the bewildered parent trying to break up a fight between two kids they just armed.
They actually tried to mediate it first. Fidel Castro flew to the region personally. He tried to get the leaders of Somalia and Ethiopia to shake hands and form a socialist federation of the Horn of Africa.
I can only imagine how that pitch meeting went. Hey guys, forget the centuries of bitter territorial dispute. Let's just hold hands for the sake of the global proletariat.
It failed miserably. The scholarly sources point out that nationalism is almost always stronger than international socialist solidarity. Somalia completely refused to withdraw. They wanted that land. So the Soviet Union had to make a very cold, hard choice. They couldn't back both sides in an active shooting war.
This is a huge takeaway for anyone studying geopolitics. Ideology takes a backseat to strategy. Why did Moscow choose Ethiopia over Somalia?
It came down to simple math and geography. Ethiopia had 10 times the population of Somalia. It was the vastly more significant strategic prize. So the Kremlin made a ruthless, pragmatic decision. They ghosted Somalia.
You'll just dump them.
Brutally. They immediately cut off all arms shipments to Somalia and initiated a massive air bridge to Ethiopia. And we aren't talking about a few crates of rifles here. This was one of the largest logistical operations the Soviet Union ever undertook.
I looked at the numbers on this, and it's staggering. It was something like $1 billion worth of arms in a matter of months. Huge Antonov transport planes landing in Addis Ababa basically around the clock.
They sent everything. T-55 and T-62 tanks, BM-21 rocket launchers, MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters. But here is the catch. Hardware is completely useless if you don't actually know how to use it.
Or because the Ethiopian army had been trained entirely on American equipment for 20 years.
Exactly. They didn't know how to drive a Soviet tank or fly a Soviet MiG.
So the Somalis are advancing across the desert thinking they have the upper hand because they actually know how to fire their Russian gear. Ethiopia has the crates of weapons, but not the skills. So who steps in?
The Cubans.
This is the part that always blows my mind. We are in the desert of East Africa, and the cavalry arrives from the Caribbean.
It is a profound testament to the internationalist spirit of the time, and specifically Cuba's aggressive foreign policy. Fidel Castro committed roughly 15 to 17,000 combat troops to Ethiopia. And these weren't fresh recruits. Many of them were battle-hardened veterans.
So just imagine being a Somali soldier. You are fighting for territory you think is historically yours. You look across the battlefield, and you aren't fighting Ethiopians. You're fighting Spanish-speaking soldiers operating Russian tanks.
It completely changed the calculus of the war. General Arnaldo Ochoa, a very prominent Cuban general, essentially took command of the Ethiopian counteroffensive. With Soviet logistics and Cuban manpower, the Ethiopian army just crushed the Somali offensive. They pushed them all the way back to the border in a matter of weeks.
So Ethiopia wins the war, the Derg secures its power, the United States is completely shut out of the country. It looks like a massive definitive victory for the Soviet bloc.
On the surface, yes. Ethiopia became the premier military power in the region overnight. They had the largest standing army in sub-Saharan Africa. They held these massive parades in Addis Ababa with giant portraits of Marx, Lenin, and Engels hanging in Revolution Square.
And there is always a boat. In these deep dives, victory isn't cheap. You don't just import half the Soviet arsenal without a massive price tag attached.
No, you don't. And this brings us to the internal cost. This is the dimension we really need to analyze carefully. The Derg had won the war, but they had militarized the entire society to do it. The economy was geared entirely toward feeding the army.
And the political repression, too. We have to talk about the Red Terror, because this wasn't just a military buildup against Somalia. It was a ruthless domestic crackdown.
It was horrific. To maintain control against internal dissent, because remember, not everyone in Ethiopia wanted a Marxist dictatorship. Mengistu and the Derg unleashed a campaign of extreme violence. Urban warfare, mass arrests, arbitrary executions.
It's just brutal.
It was explicitly designed to eliminate the eyes of the revolution, but it ended up completely hollowing out the country's civil society.
And economically speaking, you can't eat tanks.
That is the ultimate tragedy of this pivot. The agricultural sector was severely neglected. The government forced these disastrous land reforms and collectivization programs that disrupted traditional farming patterns.
Right.
So when the droughts hit in the mid-80s, the famous famine that led to Live Aid and We Are the World, it wasn't just nature. It was nature colliding with a brittle system that had spent all its resources on weapons and rigid ideology instead of infrastructure.
That is such a crucial distinction for you to understand. The famine wasn't an accident. It was exacerbated by the geopolitical pivot. The Soviet Union could send fleets of MiGs, but they weren't sending enough grain to feed the population.
Exactly. The scholarly consensus highlights this clearly. The Soviets were great at providing security assistance, but they were terrible at providing economic development or food security. Ethiopia was stuck in what economists call a dependency trap.
A dependency trap.
Yes, they had built this massive state structure, a huge army, a pervasive police state that relied 100% on a continuous pipeline of aid from Moscow.
And that system works fine as long as Moscow is feeling generous and has the cash to spare.
Right. But by the late 1980s, the world is changing again. Mikhail Gorbachev is in charge in Moscow. The Soviet economy is crumbling under its own weight. They look at their global balance sheet and see they're pouring billions into Ethiopia for very little tangible return.
So the phone calls to the Kremlin start to go unanswered.
Basically, yes. The arms shipments slowed down and then stopped. The subsidized oil shipments stopped. And without that external prop, the Derg's military machine just ran out of gas, literally and figuratively.
It's a house of cards falling down.
Rebel groups within Ethiopia, specifically the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, had been fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains for years. As the Soviet support evaporated, these groups gained incredible momentum. They started closing in on the capital.
And in 1991, the whole thing collapses. The Soviet Union officially dissolves, and the Derg falls almost simultaneously. Mengistu actually flees the country to Zimbabwe.
It is a perfect synchronization of historical events. The regime that lived by the Cold War died with the Cold War.
So when we step back and look at this entire arc, From the American spy base at Kagnu to the massive Soviet airlift to the final collapse. What are we actually learning here? Because it feels like Ethiopia was just a tragic stage for other people's drama.
I think the first big analytical lesson is about proxy dynamics. The superpower rivalry didn't fix Ethiopia's fundamental problems. It just amplified them immensely.
Yeah.
It took local conflicts, like the border dispute with Somalia or internal political dissatisfaction, and hooked them up to global military amplifiers.
It turned what could have been a regional fire into a global inferno. If the US and USSR hadn't been pumping weapons in that war, it might have been a minor border skirmish. Instead, it became a mechanized slaughter.
Precisely. And the academic sources stress a second major lesson here regarding the extreme fragility of alliances. If you were a senior Ethiopia official in 1970, you probably thought the Americans would be there forever.
Right.
If you were there in 1980, you thought the Soviets were the permanent future. Both assumptions were completely wrong.
It really highlights that nations don't have permanent friends, they just have permanent interests. The US dropped Ethiopia when the revolution happened because they didn't like the new management. The Soviets dropped Somalia the second a better strategic offer came along.
And the Soviets eventually dropped Ethiopia when they simply ran out of money. It is a brutal reminder that building your entire national security strategy on the generosity of a foreign power is a ticking time bomb.
That is exactly the provocative thought I want to leave everyone with today. Because we see this dynamic playing out even now on the modern map. Countries are constantly scrambling to align with a global superpower thinking it is a solid insurance policy.
But it rarely is.
Right. If history teaches us anything, it's that geopolitical insurance policies have a lot of fine print, and sometimes the insurance company just goes bankrupt.
Or they just look at a spreadsheet and decide you aren't worth paying the premium for anymore.
A cheery thought to end on, but that is the reality of the map. It's not just static lines and colors, it's a constant shifting calculation of risk and survival.
Absolutely. You always have to keep questioning the map.
Well, that is it for this deep dive into Ethiopia's Cold War pivot. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.